In the summer of 1962, a demolition crew arrived at the Beaumont Estate, 20 miles outside New Orleans. The property had been abandoned for decades. Vines choked the columns. The floorboards had rotted through. The parish had finally approved its destruction. On the third day, they broke through a wall in the east wing. The foreman's hammer punched through plaster, and the wall gave way differently than it should have. There was a hollow space behind it. Not a gap between studs. A room. A sealed room that didn't appear on any of the architectural plans. When they tore the wall down completely, they found it. A chamber, roughly 12 by 15 feet. No windows. A single door that had been bricked over from the outside, then concealed with plaster and wallpaper that matched the hallway. Inside, the air hadn't moved in over a century. There was a desk. Oil lamps, long dry. And 17 leather-bound ledgers stacked in perfect order on built-in shelves. The kind of records a meticulous businessman would keep. Dates. Names. Measurements. Transactions. Bloodlines traced back through 4 generations with the precision of a stockbreeder's stud book. But these weren't horses. The first ledger was labeled 1801, Acquisitions and Initial Pairings. The last one ended abruptly in April of 1862. A sentence stopped mid-word, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted and never returned. The crew foreman called the parish sheriff. The sheriff called the historical society. By evening, a historian from Tulane University was sitting in that sealed room, reading by flashlight, and when he emerged 3 hours later, his hands were shaking. He asked them to seal the room again. To brick it back up and forget they'd found it. 2 of the men on his committee agreed. But one refused. She insisted the documents be preserved. Catalogued. Studied. They spent 4 months fighting over what to do with the ledgers. The records were never made public. They were filed away in a university archive, accessible only with special permission. For 60 years, fewer than 20 people requested to see them. Most were genealogists, searching for names. A few were historians researching the antebellum economy. None of them published what they found. The Beaumont family had been respected. Wealthy. Their name was on a street in the French Quarter, on a library, on a scholarship fund that still exists today. They attended the finest churches, hosted governors and senators, donated generously to charities. Their obituaries spoke of Christian virtue and civic duty. But in that sealed room, they had kept a different kind of record. A record of what they actually did. What they built in plain sight on that estate, while the rest of Louisiana society looked the other way, or perhaps, chose not to look at all. This is the story of what was written in those ledgers. The story of the people whose names appear in those careful, methodical entries. And the story of a family that believed they could hide the truth behind a brick wall. They were wrong. If you want to hear what those ledgers revealed, what secrets the Beaumont family kept for over a century, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next will change how you understand this period of history. The full story is darker and more calculated than you can imagine, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why they tried so hard to keep it hidden. Stand today where the Beaumont Estate once sprawled across 600 acres of Louisiana lowland, and you'll find almost nothing left. The main house was demolished in 1962. The sugar mill burned in 1947. The overseer's cottage collapsed under a hurricane in 1983. But the slave quarters remain. 22 structures, arranged in 2 parallel rows, facing each other across a muddy corridor that still floods when the bayou rises. They're smaller than you'd expect. Each one housed between 8 and 12 people. The doorways are low. You have to duck to enter. Inside, there are iron rings bolted to the walls. Historians debated for years what those rings were for. The ledgers explained it. A live oak tree stands at the north end of the quarters. Its trunk is 15 feet around, and its branches spread wide enough to shade half an acre. Carved into the bark, worn smooth by time but still visible, are letters and numbers. Initials. Dates. Words in French and English and what might be West African languages, though no one's been able to confirm. The tree is over 300 years old. It was already mature when the Beaumont family arrived in 1798. Local teenagers used to come here to drink and carve their own names into the bark, treating the tree like any other landmark. But in 1994, a graduate student doing field research noticed something about the older carvings. They weren't random. They formed a pattern. A record, etched into living wood by people who had no other way to leave evidence they existed. The parish fenced off the property after that. It's not a tourist site. There are no guided tours, no historical markers explaining what happened here. The land belongs to a preservation trust, but they've never opened it to the public. If you ask why, they'll tell you the structures are too unstable. Too dangerous. But that's not the real reason. Etienne Beaumont arrived in Louisiana in 1798 with a land grant from the Spanish colonial government, 47 enslaved people purchased in Charleston, and a reputation as a disciplined, educated man. He'd studied agriculture in France before the Revolution. He understood crop rotation, soil chemistry, the economics of export markets. He was 31 years old. Within 5 years, he'd built the estate into one of the most profitable sugar operations in the territory. By 1810, he owned 212 people. By 1820, that number had grown to 349. By 1830, over 500. Other planters noticed. The typical plantation had a mortality rate that required constant new purchases to maintain population. Beaumont rarely went to auction. His numbers grew year after year without significant outside acquisition. When asked, he attributed it to humane management practices and proper nutrition. He wrote articles for agricultural journals about the importance of adequate food rations and dry housing. He claimed his approach was more profitable than the brutal methods employed by his neighbors. He became known as a progressive, a reformer. Someone who proved you could be successful without resorting to the worst excesses of the system. His wife, Marie-Therese, was the daughter of a French nobleman who'd fled the Revolution. She hosted salons, organized charity events for orphans, taught Sunday school at St. Augustine's Church. Their daughters were educated, well-mannered, introduced to society at lavish balls held in the estate's ballroom. Their sons were sent to universities in Philadelphia and Boston, then returned to manage different aspects of the operation. The eldest, Edouard, oversaw the sugar processing. The second son, Antoine, managed the fields. The youngest, Henri, kept the books. To everyone who visited, the Beaumonts appeared to run a well-ordered, almost genteel operation. Visitors remarked on how well-behaved and healthy the enslaved population appeared. How the quarters were neat and organized. How the children seemed numerous and thriving. A travel writer from Boston, visiting in 1834, wrote, "One might almost forget the moral stain of the institution when observing the apparent contentment and industry on display at the Beaumont Estate." That writer never saw the sealed room. Never read the ledgers. Never spoke to the people he described as content. He saw exactly what Etienne Beaumont wanted him to see. In March of 1835, a woman named Celeste ran. She made it 47 miles before they caught her. She'd stolen a set of men's clothing, cut her hair short, and walked north along the river roads at night, hiding during the day in the swamps. She knew where the patrols ran. She knew which roads to avoid. She'd been planning it for months. When they dragged her back, she wasn't alone. She had a child with her. A girl, maybe 6 years old, who clung to her and wouldn't speak. Etienne Beaumont didn't whip Celeste. He didn't put her in chains. Instead, he separated her from the child immediately. Permanently. He sold the girl to a trader heading to Mississippi within 48 hours. Then he moved Celeste to a different section of the quarters, assigned her to a different work crew, and made sure she understood the message. Run, and you lose everyone. But Celeste had done something else before she ran. She'd spoken to a Quaker missionary who'd been passing through the area, offering religious instruction to enslaved people on plantations whose owners permitted it. Beaumont had allowed it, seeing it as another mark of his progressive approach. The missionary's name was Thomas Webb. He kept a journal. In it, dated February 18, 1835, he recorded a conversation with a woman he identified only as C. She told him things that troubled him deeply. Things about how children were assigned to specific cabins. About men and women who were forced together regardless of their wishes. About records kept in a locked room that only the family entered. Webb didn't know what to do with the information. He was a guest on the property. He had no authority, no proof. He wrote to his church elders asking for guidance, describing what he'd been told in careful, coded language. His letter was intercepted. A postmaster in Baton Rouge, sympathetic to planter interests, routinely opened mail from known abolitionists and reported anything suspicious. Webb's letter landed on a parish judge's desk. The judge sent word to Beaumont. Webb was escorted off the property the next day and told never to return. His journal was confiscated. He was warned that spreading rumors about respectable families could result in legal action. He left Louisiana a week later and never came back. But he'd already made copies of his journal entries. He'd sent them to his brother in Philadelphia, who passed them to an abolitionist newspaper. They published excerpts in April of 1835, without naming the plantation or family. The article described a systematic breeding operation, managed with the cold efficiency of livestock husbandry, where human beings are paired like cattle and their children tracked in ledgers as future assets. Southern newspapers denounced it as abolitionist propaganda. Lies designed to inflame passions. Fantasies invented by people who'd never set foot on a working plantation. Etienne Beaumont never responded to the accusations. He didn't need to. His reputation protected him. His neighbors closed ranks. Within a month, the story had faded from public attention. But inside the sealed room, the ledgers continued. The entries didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. Because the article had changed nothing. Webb was gone. Celeste's daughter was gone. And the system Beaumont had built operated exactly as it had before, hidden in plain sight, protected by respectability and silence. What Webb didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the breeding operation was only part of it. That the ledgers documented something larger. Something that had been running for 37 years by the time he arrived. Something that involved every member of the Beaumont family. And something that wouldn't be fully exposed for another 127 years, when a demolition crew's hammer broke through a wall that was never meant to be opened. The first ledger, the one labeled 1801, Acquisitions and Initial Pairings, began with a list. 47 names, ages ranging from 14 to 38. Next to each name, Etienne Beaumont had recorded physical characteristics. Height, build, scars, teeth condition. Then he'd added notes. Strong back. Field work. Skilled carpenter. Valuable. Young, healthy. Breeding potential high. That last notation appeared next to 23 of the names. 13 women. 10 men. By December of that same year, Beaumont had begun what he called strategic alignments. He'd moved people between cabins, separating some families, forcing others together. The ledger recorded each move with the date and a brief justification. Mary to cabin 7 with Joseph. Both young, strong stock. Peter to cabin 3 with Sarah and Agnes. 1 male, 2 females optimal ratio. He was experimenting. Testing different approaches to maximize what he called productive increase. By 1803, the ledger showed the results. 8 births that year. Beaumont noted each one with satisfaction, recording the parents, the child's sex, and his assessment of the infant's future value. He gave them names from a list he kept in the back of the ledger. French names, mostly. Names that meant nothing to the parents but sounded civilized to visitors. A child born to a woman named Judith was called Jean-Baptiste in the ledger. His mother called him something else, a name from her own language, but that name doesn't appear anywhere in Beaumont's records. By 1805, Beaumont had refined his system. He'd identified what he considered the most valuable genetic lines. Women who'd produced healthy children quickly. Men who seemed to father strong offspring. He began separating children from their mothers earlier, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, and moving them to different cabins where they'd grow up prepared for their eventual role in his system. The ledger from 1807 introduced a new category, second-generation pairings. Children born on the estate, now reaching adolescence, being matched according to Beaumont's careful breeding plan. He tracked bloodlines like a horse breeder, avoiding certain combinations, encouraging others. A girl named Marie, born in 1802, was paired with a boy named Thomas, born in 1801, when she turned 15. The ledger noted, both second generation. Strong parentage. Expecting optimal outcomes. Marie gave birth to her first child 9 months later. She was still 15. The ledger recorded 7 more pregnancies for Marie over the next 11 years. 5 of the children survived past infancy. Beaumont noted this as a success rate of 71%, better than the estate average of 63%. He never recorded what Marie thought about any of it. Whether she wanted to be with Thomas. Whether she mourned the 2 children who died. Whether she resented being torn from her mother's cabin at age 6 to be raised specifically for this purpose. She existed in the ledger only as a production unit. And she was one of the successful ones. By 1815, Beaumont's operation had attracted attention from other planters, though most of them didn't know the full extent of his methods. They saw his numbers. They saw that his enslaved population grew faster than anyone else's in the parish. They wanted to know his secret. Beaumont gave lectures at planter associations. He published articles. But he never told them about the ledgers. He never explained the sealed room, the careful tracking, the forced pairings, the systematic separation of families to serve his breeding goals. Instead, he talked about nutrition and housing. He talked about the economic benefits of natural increase versus constant purchases. He talked about treating enslaved people as valuable investments that required proper maintenance. Other planters nodded along. Some of them adopted his recommendations about food rations and cabin construction. A few of them tried to replicate his success, implementing their own breeding programs with varying degrees of organization. But none of them matched Beaumont's meticulousness. None of them kept records like he did. And none of them built it into such a comprehensive, multi-generational system. By 1820, the estate's population had reached 349. 217 of them had been born there. Beaumont knew the parentage of every single one. He knew which bloodlines produced the strongest field workers, which ones produced skilled craftsmen, which ones produced women who could bear many children and survive the repeated pregnancies. He'd created a human breeding program that had been running for 22 years, and he'd done it while maintaining a reputation as one of Louisiana's most enlightened plantation owners. His sons were learning the system now. Edouard was 23. Antoine was 21. Henri was 19. They each had responsibilities in the operation, but Henri, the youngest, had taken over maintaining the ledgers. Henry's entries were even more detailed than his father's. He added columns. He tracked more variables. He noted which pairings produced children who reached adulthood without significant illness, which ones resulted in difficult births, which bloodlines seemed prone to resistance or escape attempts. Henri believed you could breed out defiance. His notes from 1822 suggested that children born to parents who'd never attempted escape were less likely to run themselves. He began tracking this, noting compliant stock versus problematic lines. When a man named Samuel tried to escape in 1824, Henri noted it in the ledger next to his name. Samuel was caught, severely punished, and Henri wrote, Samuel, age 29, escape attempt. Father was also a runner. Confirming hereditary resistance patterns. Future pairings from this line should be limited. Samuel was paired with a woman named Rebecca specifically because Henri believed her compliant bloodline might dilute what he saw as Samuel's genetic tendency toward resistance. They had 3 children together. The ledger tracked all of them, noting which traits they seemed to inherit. Whether they were tractable or willful. Whether they worked without complaint or required supervision. Henri was trying to breed human beings the way you'd breed dogs. Selecting for obedience. Eliminating rebellion through controlled reproduction. And he was doing it with his father's full approval. The system had grown beyond simple economics now. It had become a project. A grand experiment in human control that the Beaumont family pursued with academic interest and careful documentation. Marie-Therese, the matriarch, managed her own part of it. She oversaw the female quarters, decided which women were ready for pairing, supervised the childbirths, determined when children would be separated from their mothers. The ledgers show her handwriting in certain sections, particularly notes about women's health and childbearing capacity. In 1826, she wrote, Esther delivered 4th child with difficulty. Recommend resting period before next pairing. Asset too valuable to risk with excessive frequency. Esther was 23 years old. She'd given birth to 4 children in 6 years. 1 had died in infancy. Marie-Therese wasn't concerned about Esther's suffering. She was concerned about protecting her investment. The Beaumont daughters knew about the system too. They'd grown up in a house where this was normal. Where people were inventory. Where children were separated from mothers as casually as calves from cows. Where human reproduction was discussed at the dinner table as a matter of farm management. The eldest daughter, Marguerite, married a planter from Natchez in 1828. Her husband later implemented a similar breeding program on his own plantation, with advice from the Beaumont family. The practice was spreading, quietly, through networks of wealthy planters who saw the economic benefit. By 1830, the estate population exceeded 500. 392 had been born there. The quarters had been expanded twice to accommodate the growth. New cabins built in the same efficient rows, same small dimensions, same iron rings in the walls. Those rings served multiple purposes. Sometimes they were used for punishment, people shackled there for days as discipline. Sometimes they were used to prevent escape, securing people at night. And sometimes they were used to enforce pairings, to ensure that the breeding program continued according to the ledgers. A woman named Hannah tried to refuse her assigned pairing in 1831. She was 20 years old. The man Beaumont had selected for her was twice her age, known for violence, someone she'd watched beat his previous partner. She said no. Henri recorded it in the ledger. Hannah, cabin 14, refused alignment with Marcus. Subjected to standard correction protocols. Compliance achieved after 6 days. Standard correction protocols meant she was shackled to the wall ring, given minimal food and water, isolated until she broke. After 6 days, she stopped refusing. The ledger shows her first child was born 9 months later. Henri noted, Hannah pairing successful. Offspring appears healthy. Subject now compliant. Hannah had 2 more children in the next 4 years. She appears in the ledger 12 more times, each entry noting her pregnancies, births, and the survival of her children. After 1835, there are no more entries about her. No note about her death. No record of sale. She simply disappears from the documentation. Hundreds of people have disappeared like that from these ledgers. Present for years, dozens of entries tracking their lives in cold notation, then nothing. No explanation. No closure. Some of them died. Some of them were sold when they were no longer useful to the breeding program. Some of them may have escaped, though successful escapes were rare and the ledgers usually noted attempts. But many of them simply vanish from the record, erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only those brief entries documenting their suffering. By 1835, when Celeste Wren and Thomas Webb wrote his journal entries, the Beaumont breeding program had been operating for 37 years. Over 400 people had been born into it. The system touched every aspect of life on the estate. Who you lived with. Who you were forced to be with. When your children were taken. Whether you were considered valuable enough to receive adequate food and shelter. The ledgers show that Beaumont classified people into tiers. Tier 1 were the prime breeding stock, the people whose bloodlines he valued most. They received better rations, slightly larger living spaces, occasional medical care when they were ill. Not out of compassion, but because they were valuable inventory. Tier 2 were skilled workers. Blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, seamstresses. People whose labor was valuable but who weren't prioritized for breeding. They were sometimes paired, sometimes not. Their children weren't tracked as carefully. Tier 3 were field workers who didn't fit Beaumont's breeding criteria. Older people. People with disabilities or chronic illnesses. People whose bloodlines he decided weren't worth continuing. They received minimal rations, the hardest work, the worst shelters. The ledgers show their mortality rates were significantly higher. And then there was a fourth category, unlabeled but present in the records. People who'd been deemed problems. Repeated escape attempts. Resistance. Refusal to cooperate with the breeding program. These people were sometimes sold, but more often they were sent to what the ledgers called remote fields. The remote fields were sections of the property far from the main quarters, in the swampiest, most disease-ridden parts of the estate. The work there was brutal. The conditions were deliberately worse. It was punishment, but it was also a message to everyone else about what happened if you resisted. A man named Isaac was sent to the remote fields in 1833 after his third escape attempt. The ledger entry is brief, Isaac to remote assignment. Indefinite duration. There are no more entries about Isaac. He was 31 years old when he disappeared into those fields. Whether he died there, whether he survived, whether he ever made it out, the ledger doesn't say. This was the system that Thomas Webb glimpsed when he spoke to Celeste in February 1835. This was what she tried to tell him about, knowing he was her only chance to get word to the outside world. This was what she was running from when she took that little girl and headed north in March. And this was what continued, unchanged, after Webb was expelled and Celeste's daughter was sold and the abolitionist newspapers published their reports. Because the Beaumont family had something that protected them. Wealth. Reputation. Political connections. The support of every other planter in Louisiana who had similar systems, or who benefited from looking the other way. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, the estate's population had grown to over 700. 533 had been born there, descendants of the original 47 people Etienne Beaumont had purchased in 1798. The ledgers track them all, generation after generation, a documentary record of systematic dehumanization maintained with academic precision for 63 years. But in April of 1862, something happened that made Henri Beaumont stop writing mid-sentence and never return to the sealed room. Union forces were moving up the Mississippi. New Orleans had fallen. The plantations along the river were being occupied, and enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines by the hundreds. The Beaumont family could see their world collapsing. Henry's last entry, the one that stops mid-word, reads, April 17, 1862. Reports of federal troops approaching from the south. Considering contingencies for protecting valuable stock and maintaining operations should occupation OCC. The sentence just ends. The ink trails off. The ledger closes. Within a week, over 300 people had fled the Beaumont Estate. They walked away from the quarters, away from the breeding program, away from the ledgers that had documented their lives like livestock inventory. They walked toward the Union lines, toward uncertainty, toward freedom. The Beaumonts tried to stop them. Edouard organized patrols. Antoine appealed to Confederate authorities. Henri frantically tried to track who was leaving, who was staying, attempting to maintain his careful records even as the system disintegrated around him. But it was over. The breeding program that had operated for 64 years collapsed in a matter of weeks. The people who'd been categorized, paired, tracked, and controlled simply left. And there was nothing the Beaumont family could do to stop them. By May of 1862, fewer than 100 people remained on the estate, mostly elderly individuals too sick or frail to travel. The fields went unplanted. The sugar mill sat idle. The quarters emptied out. Etienne Beaumont, now 94 years old, died in June of 1862. The obituary in the New Orleans paper praised his contributions to Louisiana agriculture and his reputation as a humane planter. It made no mention of the ledgers. No mention of the sealed room. No mention of the hundreds of people whose lives he'd controlled and documented with such methodical cruelty. His sons survived the war. They lost the estate, lost most of their wealth, but they survived. They moved to New Orleans, found work in business, gradually rebuilt their fortunes. They remained respected members of society. They married, had children, lived comfortable lives. None of them ever spoke publicly about the breeding program. None of them acknowledged what they'd done. The ledgers remained in that sealed room, bricked up, concealed, forgotten by everyone except the people who'd lived through the system. And those people, the survivors, carried the knowledge with them. They passed down stories to their children and grandchildren. They remembered the names that weren't in the ledgers. They remembered the real names, the ones their families had used, not the French names Beaumont had assigned. They remembered who was related to whom, which families had been torn apart, which children had been sold away. For decades, that oral history was all that existed. The ledgers were hidden. The Beaumont family's reputation remained intact. The street kept its name. The library kept its name. The scholarship fund continued. And then, in 1962, a demolition crew broke through a wall. The historian who read those ledgers by flashlight tried to keep them sealed because he knew what they meant. He knew they documented crimes that respectable families had committed. He knew they implicated not just the Beaumonts but dozens of other planter families who'd known about the system, visited the estate, implemented similar programs on their own properties. He knew that revealing the ledgers would force Louisiana to confront a truth it had spent a century avoiding. That the wealthy families who built New Orleans, who built Baton Rouge, who built the entire antebellum economy, had done it through systematic breeding programs that treated human beings as livestock. That these programs weren't aberrations. They weren't the work of a few sadistic individuals. They were calculated business operations, documented and refined over generations, protected by law and social acceptance. That the humane planters, the progressive ones, the ones who got praised for better rations and decent housing, were often running the most sophisticated breeding programs. Because they understood that healthy people reproduced more successfully. That adequate nutrition led to higher birth rates and better survival rates. That cruelty could be efficient. That it could be systematic. That it could hide behind respectability and Christian virtue and claims of benevolence. The ledgers proved all of that. They documented it in meticulous detail, in handwriting that was educated and precise, in language that was cold and clinical. They showed exactly how the system worked, who profited from it, how it was maintained across generations. And they named names. Not just the Beaumonts, but visitors who'd toured the estate and praised the operation. Planters who'd consulted with Etienne about breeding strategies. Doctors who'd provided medical advice to maximize pregnancy success rates. Ministers who'd blessed unions that were forced, that were selected purely for breeding purposes. The ledgers implicated an entire society. That's why that historian wanted them sealed again. Because revealing them would require a reckoning that Louisiana wasn't ready for in 1962, and arguably still isn't ready for today. The compromise was to archive them. To make them available only with special permission. To let researchers see them one at a time, in controlled circumstances, with the understanding that publication would be difficult. And for 60 years, that's what happened. A handful of academics read them. A few genealogists searched them for family connections. The information stayed confined to academic circles, referenced obliquely in footnotes, never fully exposed to public view. The Beaumont family descendants, the ones still living, never acknowledged the ledgers. When journalists have tried to contact them, they've declined comment or denied knowledge of their ancestors' actions. The scholarship fund still operates. The street name remains. The library is still there. Nothing has been renamed. No plaques have been installed explaining what happened on that estate. The property remains closed to the public, the quarters slowly deteriorating, the live oak tree with its carved name standing silent witness to everything that occurred there. The people whose names appear in those ledgers, the hundreds who were born into that system, tracked like breeding stock, forced into pairings, separated from their children, they're mostly forgotten now. A few descendants have found their ancestors in the records through genealogical research. Some have tried to piece together family histories from those cold, clinical entries. But most of the stories died with the people who lived them. Most of the names that weren't recorded anywhere else have been lost. Most of the children who were separated from their parents, who grew up not knowing where they came from, took that loss to their graves. What remains is the documentary evidence of the crime. 17 leather-bound ledgers containing 64 years of meticulous records. Proof that this happened. Proof of who did it. Proof that it was systematic, calculated, maintained across generations with full knowledge and participation from an entire family. Proof that the respectable, wealthy, educated people of antebellum Louisiana built their fortunes on breeding programs that reduced human beings to genetic stock, tracked and controlled from birth to death. The ledgers are still in that archive. Still accessible with special permission. Still largely unknown to the public. Still protected by the compromise that allowed them to be preserved without requiring a full accounting of what they contain. And the question remains, how many other sealed rooms are out there? How many other families kept similar records? How many other breeding programs operated with the same systematic cruelty, documented with the same meticulous precision, then hidden away when the war ended and the system collapsed? We know the Beaumonts weren't unique. Henry's notes mention consulting with other planters about breeding strategies. Marguerite's husband implemented a similar program in Natchez. Other ledgers have been found, though none as complete or well-preserved as the Beaumont collection. The breeding programs were common enough that agricultural journals published articles about them. Common enough that planters discussed them openly at association meetings. Common enough that it was just accepted practice, something you did if you wanted to maximize profits. But the documentation mostly disappeared. Burned at the end of the war, destroyed by families who didn't want evidence of what their ancestors had done, lost in fires and floods and the general chaos of Reconstruction. The Beaumont ledgers survived only because they were sealed in that room, hidden away and forgotten until a demolition crew stumbled on them a century later. So we're left with fragments. With oral histories passed down through descendant communities. With occasional archival discoveries that reveal pieces of the system. With plantation records that show population growth that couldn't be explained by purchases alone. With archaeological evidence from quarters that shows the living conditions, the iron rings, the structures designed for control. And we're left with the question of what we do with this knowledge. Whether we continue to protect the reputations of the families who built their wealth this way. Whether we keep their names on streets and libraries. Whether we maintain the scholarship funds they established, money that came from the sale of human beings born into breeding programs. Whether we're willing to confront what the ledgers actually document. Not just abstract historical injustice, but specific, named individuals who designed, implemented, and maintained systematic breeding programs with the same care they'd give to improving livestock. Whether we're willing to say their names. Etienne Beaumont. Marie-Therese Beaumont. Edouard, Antoine, and Henri Beaumont. Marguerite Beaumont and her husband in Natchez, whose name appears in Henry's notes. The doctors and ministers and neighboring planters whose names appear throughout the ledgers as consultants and collaborators. Whether we're willing to remember the other names. Celeste, who ran and lost her daughter. Hannah, who was shackled until she stopped refusing. Isaac, who disappeared into the remote fields. Marie, who gave birth 7 times between age 15 and 26. Samuel, whose resistance was tracked as a genetic defect to be bred out. And the hundreds of others whose names appear only in those ledgers, people who existed as inventory, whose humanity was denied systematically, who lived and died under a system designed to reduce them to breeding stock. Their stories deserve to be told. The full truth deserves to be confronted. The documentary evidence exists. It's sitting in an archive, accessible to anyone willing to request it and patient enough to read through 17 ledgers of methodical horror. But we, as a society, have to be willing to look. We have to be willing to acknowledge what those ledgers reveal about the families we've honored, the wealth we've allowed to pass down through generations, the institutions that were built on the backs of people who were bred like animals. We have to be willing to say that the Beaumont family committed crimes. That their breeding program was a moral atrocity documented with chilling precision. That their respectability and philanthropy don't erase what they did. That their descendants' silence doesn't protect them from historical accountability. And we have to be willing to recognize that this wasn't rare. That the Beaumonts weren't monsters distinct from their society. They were products of it. Participants in a system that was legal, socially accepted, economically rational within its own cruel logic. That's what makes the ledgers so important. They don't just document one family's crimes. They document how a system worked. How it was maintained. How respectable people participated in it without apparent moral conflict. How it could operate in plain sight, protected by law and custom and the mutual interests of the powerful. The breeding program at the Beaumont Estate wasn't hidden from Louisiana society. It was hidden from history. From us. From the reckoning that should have happened when those ledgers were discovered in 1962. 63 years later, that reckoning still hasn't fully occurred. The ledgers remain mostly unknown. The Beaumont name remains on that street, on that library. The scholarship fund continues. And the property where it all happened sits empty, fenced off, slowly disappearing into the Louisiana swamp. But the evidence exists. The names are recorded. The truth is documented in 17 leather-bound ledgers that anyone can request to see. The sealed room has been opened. The wall has been broken down. What we do with that knowledge, whether we're finally willing to confront what it reveals, that's the question we're left with. That's the choice we have to make. Because the Beaumont family believed they could hide the truth behind a brick wall. They were wrong. The wall came down. The ledgers were found. The evidence is preserved. Now we have to decide whether we're brave enough to look at it. Whether we're honest enough to acknowledge what it means. Whether we're willing to tell the complete story, not the sanitized version that protects old money and old names, but the truth that's written in those careful, methodical entries. The truth about Louisiana 1835. The truth about the family secret that was never really hidden at all, just protected by people who chose not to see it, who chose respectability over accountability, who chose to preserve a comfortable lie rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. That choice is ours now. The ledgers are waiting. The story is there. All we have to do is be willing to tell it. If this story affected you, if you think this history needs to be told and remembered, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about how we should handle this kind of historical evidence. And share this video with others who need to hear this story. The more people who know the truth, the harder it becomes to keep it buried. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.